So it has been almost a week since the war broke out in Sudan, which almost looks like a civil war between the Sudanese army force, and then the other one is a paramilitary rapid support force, I think. What is the cause for this war? What is behind it? Just give us a picture, a background picture, what caused the war.
Okay. Yeah, it is. It is. I think important to look into the how things unfolded throughout this transition period that Sudan had been going through over the last few years since al-Bashir's government was ousted. Yeah. In that particular period in the 2000, and al-Bashir's government was pushed by months and months of protests by a number of forces, yeah, some democratic, some Islamist, and another range of coalitions basically wanting to get rid of the al-Bashir's regime. And in that process, and I think the military leadership, which sustained al-Bashir's regime for a very long time and propped up by that regime, took over power, yes, through a coup of some sort, and deposed al-Bashir, and they took over state power. And then they promised that they would hand over power to a civilian government, yeah. And of course, they were going to midwife a democracy, as it were claimed at the time. What has happened since then was a number of actors, regional, mini powers, and international powers started to rush into Khartoum and trying to influence process to serve their perceived interests. And here you would find the Egyptians, whose intelligence and military are deeply entrenched in and networked within the Sudanese state and army as well. Then the Israeli intelligence wanting to somehow, find a way to network, and the Abraham Accord was a very important narrative and important project that they were looking at mending relations with a number of states, and not just that those two closer states, but you have now the West in general, in the US in particular, trying to influence process in Sudan. You must understand the number of envoys that was sent to Sudan. And of course, soon through that kind of arrangement, Abdullah Hamdok came to power through lengthy negotiation, and part of it was, facilitated by regional states, and of course, Dr. Abiy was there in the initial stages. Now, Abdullah Hamdok came to assume presidency. And of course, a transitional one once again to facilitate a democratic election to take place eventually. And what has happened then was Abdullah Hamdok's move into the palace was also linked with the US's and the West in general, wanting to influence Sudan's politics. And what they tried to do was promise Sudan, to be taken off the terrorist list that America had, would get a cancellation through the Paris Club, and all the rest was promised to Sudan. In return for what? And then obviously that we all have to ask, why are they in a rush to somehow influence politics and process in Sudan? Obviously, they had their own ambition, controlling Sudan meant controlling the Red Sea. And right about the time, and I think it was in 2017, al-Bashir's government had already initiated an engagement with the Russians to give them some kind of logistics hub, as as it's now being called, a euphemism for a military base of sort, a naval military base of some sort by the Red Sea coast. And that negotiation was something that somehow scared the West as well. And you also have to understand the Nile politics, the Egypt and the Israelis and the Americans, and that they were supporting TPLF through their different networks, and of course Sudan was very important a part of that equation as well. They see the Horn of Africa as moving away from them, so the fallback position would be having Sudan and using Sudan as sort of trying to corner this region, and find to find the means and ways to somehow continue to influence the region to their perceived interests. So, number of players. Again, the Saudis and the Emiratis are also part of the equation as well, backing one or the other group within that. And in this, then the Americans started to see that this is going nowhere to their perceived objective. So what they try to do is, and not only the US, but also other mini powers, they started to see that if you have now a democratic process in Sudan, you're not going to get your favorite person in a position of power. So what you need to do is you have to become kingmaker, and for that to happen, then you have to have one or the other powerful players. And here, then it emerged. The civilian part of it was sort of marginalized, and they started to prop up those generals. On one hand, the leading the Sudanese army, SAF, Sudanese armed forces, and then on the other, Hamditi, who's running the Sudanese forces. So what they have managed to do is now cause a collision between those two, instead of allowing them to work their differences internally. Too many cooks in this kitchen, always you're going to have too many troubles. So you remember we spoke about the possibility of proxy war emerging in Africa, each rival group trying to support one or the other in an attempt to influence the state, control the state, capture the state, and that way then you would project your power in the region. Now the Russians have already they have made their presence felt in Central African Republic. Not only there, but then in that region, in the western and Sahelian region. And if you have Sudan connected to that, then now you have access to the Red Sea that connects it all the way to the Central African Republic, and possibly also all the way to West Africa. Very important. You have to understand. Now, it is extracting of resources and outlet to the resources that they are planning to extract from those areas. Remember, the Wagner Group is there to protect areas, and of course, trying to stabilize those states. You need extractive activities also require that, in as much as instability is also a very important way of getting your feet into it. And eventually you need to have a stable state. That's what they're trying to do. So connecting Central African Republic all the way to the Red Sea meant a very important, projection of power and access to resources. That influence is very important. And Americans are jittery about it, and they're trying to find a way to break that. And of course, it's not just that. It is losing the Horn of Africa altogether. They need an alternative. They have no access to the Red Sea via Eritrea. And if Sudan falls away as well, then a large chunk of it is not going to be accessible to them, at least on the African side. We all know now on the on the West Asian side is also problematic for the Americans, increasingly becoming problematic. Yeah, so it is within this kind of framework that those two generals and forces found themselves in a loggerhead. Yeah, and this unfortunately happened for Sudanese people in the most holy months of Ramadan. You would not expect military leaders, politicians stirring chaos at this particular season, and that tells you something is unwholesome here. Yeah, and the brutality, the way it is being waged now, it is in the urban areas. Yeah, fighting is taking place in the middle of suburbs and residential areas. The casualties are not only just soldiers but also civilians, and this is troublesome. Yeah, and it's a very hot season. Yeah, and now they have already cut water. Electricity is also out apparently, from what I've heard, and this is not a way to handle this kind of situation. I remember that President Isaias Afwerki was warning Hamditi when he left Eritrea, you guys must sort your issues internally. Don't let others interfere and meddle into your internal affairs. I mean, of course, the Prime Minister Abiy also mentioned the same thing. You guys have the wisdom. Don't let others come in and interfere the way they have already, and it's really problematic. And on two poles as well, Egypt and UAE are supporting one or the other. We already established that, and Libya is involved in it as well for some strange reason. Yeah, so this is now becoming a site for that kind of intervention, an unwanted external intervention, which is going to exacerbate the problem. The ramifications are severe for all the region we're talking about. So this has to be located within that context. It's not just about Sudanese not liking each other, but external forces that are pulling the strings in those areas. And of course, I'm not saying that those two generals are holy people. They are literally crony capitalists that have been looting Sudan for far too long. Yeah, Hamditi apparently had billions. Could be a state on its own. Yeah. The same thing the generals and Abdullah Hamdok, and that fight for resource and control is also part of it, which is a very dangerous politics. But with all that, and I'm sure we know that Sudanese people have the wisdom and the patience to be able to work out their differences. I think this is enough background, and if you have any question, then I'll contribute to that.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Dr. Biniam, for that. You really give us a picture. I mean, this is almost a global war in the Northeast African country. There's Middle East, there's African countries as well. And then there is the big powers, also globally, the US, Russia.